Without change, something sleeps inside us. The sleeper must awaken.
Hello and welcome back to another We Ourselves video. And in part 2 of this series, I'm continuing the report on normalizing reparations for Black Americans, which shows this country has a long history of paying reparations to harmed Americans. As a reminder, the report was done by the Russell Sage Foundation, and it's entitled Normalizing Reparations, U.S. Precedents, Norms, and Models for Compensating Harms and the Implication for Reparations to Black Americans. In this video, we're going to cover harms that have been done to Black Americans. Why do they focus on this? Because if you can demonstrate and document a particular harm done to a particular defined group, you can push for reparatory compensation, which is exactly what the government has done in all the cases of reparations to groups of harmed Americans. We all know that homeownership is the most important asset and mechanism for the vast majorities of American households to gain personal wealth. Inherited land is also another way, and the report talks about this. Quote, despite obstacles, Black Americans after slavery managed to get 15 million acres of land in the South between emancipation and 1910 through private purchases. This particular study that the quote came out in 2001, and it says that they were able to do that in the face of unrelenting violence and discrimination. Yet, Black ownership of farmland declined to 3.9 million acres by 2017 due to a whole list of different things. And some of the things that they list in the report are these. Lack of access to capital. Again, this is what we're talking about when it comes to having our own Black-owned media. Lack of access to capital. Illegal takings. Again, that was racially based. Purposeful trickery in withholding legal information. Threatened violence, and various forms of racism and discrimination by individual, organization, and government agencies. All documented. And I just want to say, when it comes to the land that was taken, there are a couple of excellent articles out there. One was done by the Atlantic called The Great Land Robbery, and the other one was done by the New Yorker called Kicked Off the Land. An estimated 80% of white suburbs developed in the 1930s and 40s contained racially restricted covenants. Again, home ownership is the number one way for the average American family to increase their overall wealth status. And Black Americans were systematically denied access. So you don't even have to go all the way back to slavery. You just have to just start in the 20th century. The Housing Acts of 1935, again, going back to that study that was done, and the creation of the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, institutionalized a new housing finance system and spurred an increase in ownership for white Americans. Implicit and explicit racial systems built into the FHA loan program excluded most Black homeowners from receiving FHA-inspired loans and created the system known to date as redlining. And when it comes to redlining, if you want a really good book to read on that subject, it's called The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. Again, all of this is well-documented harms to a particular group of Americans. But going on with the report. Quote, FHA's preference for financing single-family residential homes as opposed to mixed business or multifamily residential housing favored in cities further restricted FHA's loans to white suburbs. And when the Service Readjustment Act, or the GI Bill, came out, it adopted FHA-like loan criteria risk assessments, preventing most neighborhoods available to Blacks from qualifying. On September 9th, 1739, approximately 100 enslaved people in the colony of South Carolina rebelled against the plantation owners, who held them in bondage, killing men, women, and children as they attempted to escape and search for freedom. This event, the Stono Rebellion, prompted the state's General Assembly to pass the Negro Act of 1740, one of the earliest pieces of legislation to explicitly outlaw the education of Black people. which formed the blueprint for later laws prohibiting education of black people. And of course, we know the history of public education and the desegregation of public education, but most of those efforts to integrate public schools stopped after the 1991 Supreme Court decision, Board of Education versus Dow, which allowed schools to be released from court monitoring and desegregation as long as the schools made a good faith effort. So again, you have a well-documented harm that was done to black education from K-12 through college. And as the report continues, because of residential segregation, black Americans have disproportionately been exposed to lead through deteriorating lead pipes, dust, and other lead-based products, which have deleterious effects on learning. And we all know about the Flint water crisis and what the lead poisoning has done to those residents and what it has done to those kids. Lead, as the report says, a neurotoxin which can permanently damage the brains of young children, resulting in decreases in IQ, more attention deficit disorders, mental illness, and developmental delays. Such environmental stressors harm the learning capability of some black children and may have long-term effects. There's no may about it. The studies have been done, and it has been shown that the lead poisoning has long-term effects. Again, it is a well-established, documented research harm to the education of black Americans. The roots of the wealth gap can be traced back not only to slavery itself, but also to the long period of labor exploitation, which started with peonage system and sharecropping. And even after the 13th and 14th Amendments were passed, states continued to force and coerce black workers into agricultural and domestic service by replacing black codes with state-enforced racial segregation. And Jim Crow laws prohibited blacks from gaining adequate education and encouraged discriminatory exclusion of blacks from educated labor forces. And I just want to say here, they're currently dismantling Social Security, but that desire to dismantle it only started when many black workers were added to it. When Social Security was first started, it excluded two classes of workers: agricultural workers and domestic servers. And they did that on purpose to exclude black workers from Social Security. So it's no surprise that they are finally getting their wish and they are going to dismantle it under this current administration. Against the backdrop of lower economic activity, you had the increase in black male incarceration. And it's interesting to note that some of the jails across the South are located on the very same spot as former plantations. So all these decades later, you have black men in chains walking on the same land where their ancestors walked as slaves. And Michelle Alexander brings that out in her book, The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in an Age of Color Blindness. Mass incarceration, which really started in the 1970s, also decreased the wages of black Americans and the economic viability of black American communities. And then we don't even have to mention the disparity in the drug laws, which were designed to target black Americans. Over and over and over, the report uses data and facts to establish a massive amount of harms that have been done to black Americans. And this is how they start their conclusion of this section. Quote, "We established that black Americans were victims of multiple interrelated harms that directly impaired health, earning capability, and the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And this is important because you have to demonstrate a verifiable harm to a particular group in order for the reparatory compensations to come into play. Going back to the report, quote, "The U.S. government has repeatedly compensated individuals for parallel, though non-racial harms that directly impaired their health, earnings, capacity, and right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Both the people who were directly affected and, in some instances, to their survivors and descendants." In other words, they did it for everybody suffering the same and similar harms except for black Americans. So don't let anybody tell you that modern day black Americans, ADOS, FBA, whatever you want to use, I use ADOS, can't receive or don't deserve reparations because they literally weren't slaves. That is not how it has worked in America. And as the study shows, there are instances where the survivors and descendants have received reparatory compensation, money. And when we get to the examples, you're going to see just how much money we're given through these programs.